It is the autumn of 2008. The global financial system is collapsing. Lehman Brothers is gone. AIG has required a federal bailout of $182 billion. Credit markets are frozen. Stock markets are in freefall. Governments around the world are mobilizing trillions of dollars in emergency support for financial institutions that, weeks earlier, had been considered the most sophisticated and well-managed in human history. In offices and trading floors and government ministries across the world, people are trying to understand what has happened, and they are reaching, with increasing urgency, for the work of an economist who has been dead for 12 years. His name is Hyman Minsky. He taught at Washington University in St. Louis. He published his most important work in the 1970s and 1980s to an audience of specialists so small that his books went out of print almost immediately. He spent his career arguing that financial markets were inherently unstable, that the longer they remained calm, the more dangerous they became, and the mainstream economics profession spent his career explaining, politely but firmly, why he was wrong. In 2008, the mainstream economics profession was discovering, at enormous cost to everyone, that he had been right. He was not there to hear it. There is a category of intellectual that every era produces and almost every era fails to reward in time. The person who sees the mechanism clearly, who understands, not just what is happening, but why it is happening and what will happen next, who publishes the work, makes the argument, invites the scrutiny, and receives in return not refutation, because the work cannot be honestly refuted, but indifference. A polite, sustained, institutionally reinforced indifference that is, in the end, more effective than any counterargument. Hyman Minsky was that person for 4 decades. His theory, which he called the Financial Instability Hypothesis, explained with mechanical precision how financial crises occur, why they are inevitable in a capitalist system, and what would be required to prevent them. It was not speculation. It was not ideology. It was a careful, empirically grounded account of how financial markets actually behave. The profession did not engage with it seriously. It engaged with it the way a well-funded establishment engages with inconvenient ideas, by not engaging with it at all. Hyman Minsky was born in Chicago in 1919, the son of immigrants from Belarus who were active in the socialist movement. His mother was a labor organizer. His father was involved in left-wing politics. The household he grew up in was one where economic questions were not abstractions. They were the lived reality of working people navigating a system that had been built by and for someone else. He studied mathematics at the University of Chicago, then economics at Harvard, where he encountered the work of John Maynard Keynes at a formative moment. Minsky became a Keynesian, but he became a particular kind of Keynesian, one who believed that most of his colleagues were misreading Keynes in ways that made the theory both more reassuring and less accurate than it actually was. The standard Keynesian model of the post-war era treated financial markets as a relatively stable backdrop to the real economy. Financial instability was an occasional aberration, not a structural feature. Minsky thought this was wrong. He thought it was wrong in a way that made the standard model not just incomplete but dangerous. That by treating financial stability as the normal condition and financial crisis as an exceptional one, mainstream economics was systematically underestimating the risks embedded in the financial system. His alternative began with a simple observation. In a capitalist economy, investment is financed by borrowing. The willingness to borrow and the willingness of lenders to lend depends on expectations about the future, and those expectations are shaped by the recent past. When the economy has been stable for a long time, when asset prices have been rising, when borrowers have been able to service their debts, the natural human response is to become more confident. Borrowers take on more debt. Lenders relax their standards. Risk premiums fall. The financial system, collectively, begins to behave as if the good times will continue indefinitely. But in becoming more confident, the system is also becoming more fragile. The more debt that is taken on, the more sensitive the system becomes to any disruption that makes it harder to service that debt. The stability itself is generating the instability. The system is, in Minsky's phrase, always moving toward fragility during periods of tranquility. He called the endpoint of this process a Minsky Moment, though he did not use that phrase himself. It was coined by others to describe his concept. The Minsky Moment is the point at which the accumulated debt burden becomes unsustainable, confidence collapses, asset prices fall, credit contracts, and the financial system moves from fragility to crisis with a speed that always surprises the people who did not see it coming. He published this theory, he taught it, he argued it at conferences. The mainstream responded with polite neglect. The economics profession in the post-war decades was not simply indifferent to Minsky. It was, in a more precise sense, invested in his being wrong. The dominant paradigm of academic economics from the 1960s onward was built on the efficient market hypothesis, the theory that financial markets incorporate all available information into prices instantaneously, ensuring that prices always reflect fundamental values. The efficient market hypothesis had powerful implications. If markets were always efficient, then government intervention in financial markets was not just unnecessary, it was actively harmful. The deregulatory agenda that dominated American and British economic policy from the late 1970s onward drew much of its intellectual legitimacy from the idea that financial markets, left to themselves, would allocate capital efficiently and manage risk appropriately. Minsky's theory said the opposite. It said that financial markets were not self-correcting but self-destabilizing, that without active regulatory intervention to constrain the accumulation of debt during boom periods, the financial system would inevitably move toward the fragility that produced crisis. This was not just an academic disagreement, it was a political one. The deregulatory agenda, the dismantling of the Glass-Steagall Act, the removal of restrictions on derivatives trading, the reduction of capital requirements, had been justified by the intellectual framework that Minsky was challenging. If Minsky was right, then a generation of deregulation had been building a financial system that was progressively more fragile, and the economists who had provided the intellectual justification for that deregulation had been wrong in ways that would eventually prove very expensive for a very large number of people. The profession did not want to hear this. Minsky retired from Washington University in 1990 and moved to the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College in New York, where he continued working until his death in October 1996. He died without a Nobel Prize. He died without seeing his theory incorporated into the models that governed financial regulation. He died, in a precise sense, too soon. The first time the phrase Minsky Moment entered the financial press was 1998. The occasion was the Russian debt default and the collapse of long-term capital management. Paul McCulley, an economist at PIMCO, used the phrase to describe the moment at which the accumulated risk in the financial system became visible and the process of deleveraging began. The phrase was noted. Minsky's name circulated briefly. And then the markets recovered, and he was returned to the category of interesting but wrong. The dot-com collapse of 2000 followed the Minsky pattern precisely. His name appeared again in commentary, again briefly, again without consequence for the mainstream models. The years between 2002 and 2007 were, by the standards of the mainstream economic models, a period of remarkable stability. Asset prices rose. Credit expanded. Alan Greenspan called the period the Great Moderation and attributed it to improvements in monetary policy and financial innovation. Minsky would have recognized it immediately. It was the classic precondition for a Minsky moment, a prolonged period of apparent stability during which risk was accumulating invisibly. Lending standards were relaxing, debt was expanding, and the financial system was becoming progressively more fragile while appearing, to the models that governed it, to be progressively more robust. In 2007, the housing market began to crack. In 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Within weeks, the phrase Minsky moment was appearing in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and in the testimony of economists before congressional committees trying to understand what had happened. His books, long out of print, were being reprinted in emergency runs to meet demand from financial professionals who suddenly needed to understand a theory they had ignored for 30 years. George Magnus, a senior economic advisor at UBS, published an analysis in August 2007 titled "You Are All Minskyites Now." It described, in real time, the unfolding of the process that Minsky had spent his career describing. Minsky had been dead for 11 years. He could not update his models. He could not testify before Congress. He had written all of that down. It was in his books, the books that had gone out of print. The books that were now being reprinted in emergency runs. He had said what needed to happen next. No one had read it in time. The recognition that followed 2008 was genuine and remarkable. Economists who had spent their careers in the mainstream tradition began engaging seriously with Minsky's work for the first time. The Levy Economics Institute became a center of serious economic policy discussion. His name entered the vocabulary of financial journalism as a permanent reference point. But the recognition had limits. The mainstream economic models were not rebuilt around Minsky's insights. They were patched. Financial frictions were added to existing frameworks. Macroprudential regulation was introduced as a policy tool in most major economies. These were improvements. They were not the fundamental rethinking that Minsky's theory demanded. The reason is not difficult to understand. Minsky's theory has an implication that is genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who believes in the efficiency of free markets. It says that financial crises are not accidents. They are the endogenous product of the financial system itself, built into the mechanism by which capitalist finance operates. You cannot prevent them by finding the right regulatory formula and leaving markets alone. You can only prevent them through continuous, active, intrusive intervention that constrains the behavior of financial institutions during boom periods. Intervention that always looks unnecessary until the moment it becomes obviously necessary. This conclusion does not fit comfortably into any political framework that places significant value on financial market freedom. And so, the profession has done what it always does with uncomfortable conclusions, incorporated the vocabulary while moderating the implications. Hyman Minsky spent 40 years in a university office, writing books that went out of print and delivering lectures to audiences that respected him without acting on what he said. He was not a charismatic public intellectual. He was not a political operator. He was an economist who had looked at the financial system with unusual honesty and described what he saw with unusual precision. What he saw was a machine that generates its own crises, a machine that is most dangerous when it appears most stable, a machine that rewards during boom periods exactly the behavior that makes the subsequent bust most severe, and a machine that will keep doing this, keep moving from stability to fragility to crisis and back again, unless the people responsible for governing it are willing to intervene continuously, actively, and against the grain of the optimism that boom periods always generate. He wrote all of this down. The books went out of print. The machine kept running. It is running now.